Good evening, everyone. So let me first cover with what our discussion on poverty. Poverty itself can be of two types. Absolute and relative. Absolute poverty means lack of basic requirements. Something which will be done in more detail very soon. Relative poverty means a situation when income of a person is less than some proportion of average income in the society. Okay, actually I wrote some proportion because this proportion may change from country to country. Okay, let's take an example. Suppose that a country decides that anyone who is earning less than 60% of their average income. Let's say in a country it is decided that any person earning less than 60% of their average income, per capita income, will be called relatively poor. So then they will calculate that how many persons are there who are having less than 60% of that average income. 60% is just an example. It can be 50, it can be 55, it can be 65. That is up to country to country. Now the focus on relative poverty will be less in this class because we do not measure relative poverty in exactly the way that it has been given in India. In India, we mainly measure absolute poverty, not relative. Relative poverty is mostly measured in the developed countries. Okay, now I hope you can guess one reason why we don't go for measurement of relative poverty, because the very fact that it is income based makes it complicated. We don't have very good access to the quality income data. In any case, it is said that when we are talking about countries which are more of less developed or developing, it is better to look into basic requirement based poverty, which is absolute. However, I would like to tell you one last thing before I start my discussion on absolute poverty. Relative poverty is not measured in India in a formal way, but informally we are looking into relative poverty. How can I say? Because relative poverty concept is similar to income inequality. Even if not the same, relative poverty concept is similar to income inequality. Let's take an example to understand. Why am I telling that? When income inequality is increasing, in a layman's sense, what do we say? We say that rich people are getting richer and poor are getting poorer. Basically, the gap between rich and poor is increasing. That is what we call income inequality. Now, when gap is increasing, generally, the richer people will be pulling the per capita income upwards. That's a common phenomenon. You will often see that the countries which are having higher income inequality will also be the countries where per capita income is going up. You can look into Latin American countries. US is one of the best examples, where per capita income is high and regularly going up. That is one of the reasons why per capita income is not considered a good measure of welfare. Okay, per capita income is not considered as a good measure of welfare because even if income inequality is rising, the per capita income will generally go up. Why does that happen? That happens because the richer people are very fast taking up the per capita income. The rich people are pulling the per capita income very fast. And that is why the per capita income increases in the societies of higher income inequality. Now think of relative poverty. Don't you think that in this situation even relative poverty will be rising? Because when per capita income is rising very fast, more and more people will be ending up with an income less than some proportion of average income. Average income is what? Per capita income. Average income is same as the per capita income. So I repeat, when the per capita income is rising very fast, then more and more people will end up with income less than the per capita income. So relative poverty and income inequality often move together. You can say that when income inequality is higher, the country must also be facing higher level of relative poverty. But I come back to the Indian setup where we do not formally measure relative, we measure the absolute poverty. From here onwards, we are going to talk more about absolute poverty. That discussion itself is quite longer, so let's talk about one by one the different aspects of it. When we talk of measure of absolute poverty, although there are many measures, but we focus primarily on a few of them. Like the first one, on which we'll be devoting quite good deal of time, is poverty line. The first measure that we talk about is poverty line. Let's begin with the definition. Poverty line refers to the level of consumption expenditure needed by an average household to fulfill basic minimum requirements for all household members. And when we talk of basic minimum requirements, what are the requirements that we are talking about? Although there is a lot of discussion around it, that what should be included and what should not be included here. Definitely in this basic minimum requirement, we include nutrition. Nutrition must be included in the basic minimum requirement. That is why you will hear that poverty line is often calorie based. That calorie is an indicator of nutrition. So food requirement or nutrition requirement is considered to be the most basic requirement. But in a modern sense, it is said that it may not only be the requirement in the basic one. For example, now in basic requirement we talk about, obviously apart from nutrition we have the clothing requirements, the shelter requirements, and also education and health requirements, etc. List can actually be longer, but this is more or less the acceptable basic minimum requirement in the modern economy, starting with nutrition and then moving on to a minimum clothing shelter requirement as well as education health requirements, etc. Initially, when we discuss the measurement, we'll talk more about nutrition, but gradually I will take you to the wider requirements also in the context of Indian economy primarily. So poverty line definition is clear enough. It is telling that what is the level of consumption expenditure needed by an average household to fulfill all basic requirements. Two more clarifications. One, poverty line in India is always based on consumption expenditure, not income. That is why this is absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is measured through consumption expenditure, not income, which is sensible. Actually, in inequality, we said that consumption expenditure is used because data on income is not available. But here, there is no need to tell that. It is logical, it is very sensible to measure absolute poverty through consumption expenditure. Why? Because consumption expenditure is a better reflector of what requirement is being consumed. We don't want to know necessarily how much income is being earned, but we want how much of the requirements are being consumed. Consumption expenditure is used here for absolute poverty. That's one. Second is, I said average household. Why is that so? Because when the data is collected for consumption expenditure, it is always easier or more convenient to collect data on household basis, not on individual basis. When we are collecting the consumption expenditure data, it is always useful to do it at household basis. It's difficult to do it at individual basis. We would like to. If you go by the logic of it, it would be better if we get it on individual, but it is not possible. Let me tell you why it is better to have individual based data, conceptually speaking. Because many a times we see, even in poverty, the social aspects coming in. For example, within the same household, there may be gender-based discrimination in terms of basic minimum requirements. So maybe the female members may not be having access to all the minimum requirements vis-a-vis the male members. That is why ideally we should have individual-based consumption, but that's very difficult. So most of the calculation in poverty is based on household. However, many a times we convert it on individual basis. In order to do that, we have to take some average number of members in the household. A common rule here in India has been that the average number of members in the household has been taken to be 5. The average number of members in the household has been taken to be 5. So accordingly, the exact value of the poverty line can be changing. I think the time now is to take an example of poverty line, and through that example we'll also see what can be some of the limitations of the poverty line. What we have done in the definition seems to tell that poverty line is like an imaginary consumption expenditure line. So it's like some imaginary consumption expenditure line on the basis of which the population is being divided in two parts. Suppose this line in our example denotes ₹1,000 per person per month. Well, before I proceed with the example, this is how the poverty line units generally look like. In any poverty line, you will see two things in the unit. One will be either per person or per household, and the other will be a time, like here month. The logic is following. Like when I say ₹1,000 per person per month, I mean that on an average, a person would be needing at least a consumption expenditure of ₹1,000 over a period of a month to get all basic minimum requirements. I repeat, the interpretation of this is, on an average, a person living in India will need ₹1,000 of expenditure over a period of month to consume the basic minimum requirements. I hope it is clear enough. In fact, you will see that this example is not that unrealistic also. But fine, that is the part which we do in Indian economic context slightly later. Once this has been decided, then the population is divided in two parts, which we call APL and BPL, the above poverty line and the below poverty line. Whoever is found to have spent more than 1000 rupees a person a month will be called APL, and similarly whoever has not been found to do that will be called BPL. This is how, and those who are BPL, they are typically called to be poor. Now let's talk about an example further. Suppose that there is a person A who is lying just above poverty line, because in the survey it was found that he was spending 1010 rupees per month. While a person B is below poverty line because he was found to spend, let's say, 990 rupees in that month. I hope you can see a limitation of poverty line here. I'm trying to give you not just the example but limitation. These two persons A and B have very negligible difference in their consumption expenditure. It's merely 20 rupees a month, not even 1 rupee a day. The difference in their expenditure is not even 1 rupee a day. Yet one is officially APL, the other is officially BPL. Now let me be clear on one thing. I'm not complaining why the person A is non-poor. It's not about being kind of a complainant about the person A. The problem is slightly different. The problem is following. If I ask you that, practically speaking, who do you think will be having a better standard of living? Practically speaking, who will have a better standard of living? It will be person B. It will be the person who is below poverty line. Why? Because he would be having access to most of the government schemes, subsidies. Okay, government schemes may be related to job creation or subsidies related to, say, food grain. So since the person B will be having greater access to the government welfare or other subsidies related activities, practically speaking, person B will always have a better standard of living than the person A. Did you notice the very logic of, the very rationale of poverty line has been defeated? Poverty line was supposed to separate haves and have-nots. The idea was that we are separating out those who are better off or haves from the have-nots. But if they are very close to each other around the poverty line, this purpose is not getting fulfilled. That is why one limitation of poverty line is, let me put it on the next page. One limitation of poverty line is, it's a crude measure of poverty. By crude measure of poverty, we mean some persons just below poverty line may have a better standard of living than just above poverty line. Okay. Before I give you the second limitation, I'll come back to that representation. But before I give you that limitation, let's talk about a term related to poverty line, which is called head count ratio. Head count ratio uses poverty line concept to give us incidence of poverty. So head count ratio measures number of BPL households divided by number of total households into 100, because normally we give it in percentage form. So what proportion of total households are BPL is the meaning of head count ratio. So suppose that head count ratio of India is 22%. I give you this information. It means that about 22% of the households are below poverty line, or they are not able to spend enough to consume the basic minimum requirements. Now HCR is a very simple measure, but it is only looking into incidence of poverty. Where incidence of poverty means the proportion of poor population. Whenever we talk only about proportion of poor population, we call it incidence of poverty. Like in this discussion, we'll say that by poverty line estimate, the incidence of poverty is 22%. Remember, the moment I change poverty line as a measure, the incidence will also change. We'll discuss that. By poverty line measure, the incidence of poverty is given by head count ratio. So this is just to make you familiar with the terms which are common in poverty, like incidence. There is one more term which is very commonly used, depth of poverty or intensity of poverty. Depth or intensity of poverty means that how much, as the name itself is, depth of the poverty. What is the gap, or you can call it average gap, between poverty line and the actual consumption expenditure. I'll tell you about one concept that looks into it. But before that, if I ask you that does HCR tell us about intensity of poverty? No, clearly no. That is a limitation of poverty line or HCR which is related to it. One limitation, we said it is a crude measure, and the reason I gave. The other limitation is that HCR, which is based on poverty line, tell us only about incidence of poverty, not about intensity or depth of poverty. Let's take an example to understand this. I go back to the same representation as I took earlier, and I make this example slightly more detailed. Suppose that there are two more persons, call them C and D, who are also below poverty line. C is below poverty line because C has been found to spend only, let's say, 700 rupees last month. D is below poverty line because he was found to have spent, let's say, only 500 rupees last month. Now, if I ask you that what will HCR tell me? HCR will only tell me that look, three of them are below poverty line, full stop. Incidence. They will not tell that B, C and D are very different and that any common onlooker can see. Why they are different? Because their gaps are different. Or in other words, you can say that D is in much deeper poverty than C and C is in deeper poverty than B. The bracketed portions here are telling you about the gap from the poverty line. D is in deeper poverty than C, C is in deeper poverty than B. But then HCR is not telling us anything about it. This is another limitation of poverty line and HCR. So this is, if you wish to write, you can. The second limitation is that HCR based on poverty line only measures the incidence of poverty. We have something which can be used to measure the intensity also, although there are many, but generally for the GS purposes you have to be limited on this part. Like one such measure is called poverty gap ratio. We first talk about poverty gap. Poverty gap refers to the average shortfalls of the BPL population from the poverty line. And when we talk of average shortfall, we are talking in terms of consumption expenditure. The average shortfall is in terms of the consumption expenditure. Like in our example, suppose I tell you to get poverty gap. How will you proceed? Although, just for your understanding, you will take average of these bracketed parts. Okay, but one thing needs to be clarified, which is when we say average shortfall of BPL population from poverty line, this average is calculated over entire population. Entire population as in BPL plus APL. Okay, a common person may think that it will be averaged only over BPL. No. We take the poverty gap and then average it over the entire population. Rationale is following. The basic interpretation of poverty gap is how much of average income will be needed to take all BPL persons on the poverty line. What will be the average income needed to take all the BPL persons on the poverty line? Now, this income is a hypothetical terminology. It is not that actually they are being given income. It's only being calculated that how much of income, if we provide to the all BPL population, will take them on the poverty line. So, since this income is going to come mainly from the APL population, hence the average is on APL plus BPL. Okay, so average of poverty gap is calculated over the entire population. And what about poverty gap ratio? Poverty gap ratio or PGR, sometimes called PGI, poverty gap index, is nothing but the ratio of poverty gap and poverty line. So, poverty gap upon poverty line gives us a ratio of poverty gap or an index. Basically, by poverty gap or poverty gap ratio, we are measuring intensity of poverty or depth of poverty. This is the reason why a concept like PGR is important.